2023. This is one of the best years the gaming industry has seen in a very long time, with so many great titles releasing back to back to back with very little downtime in between. There were so many genuinely great games that came out this year that 2023 could easily be considered one of the best times to be a gamer, no matter what genre you prefer, because there's just a little something for everybody. You got Baldur's Gate 3 for the turn-based RPG enjoyers, Tears of the Kingdom for the open world exploration enjoyers, Dead Space Remake for the survival horror enjoyers, and so much more that'll take me too long to list out. And as someone who enjoys most genres, sorry sports games, it's just not my thing, I had no shortage of games to review on this channel. A lot of these games were legitimately some of the best games I've ever played in my life, and some of the others were absolutely the worst games I've ever played. But overall, I'd say that there was way more good than bad that came out in 2023. So many good games, in fact, that I just felt like making a top 10 list would leave out so many great games that deserve the spotlight, but are overshadowed by the absolute titans that came out this year. So what I did is I compiled a list of all the good games that I thought were worthy enough to make my top 10 list, which includes everything from AAA games to AA games to indie games to even games made by one dude in his mom's basement. But instead of doing a top 10 list like everyone else is, I'm gonna do a top 20 list of what I thought were the most definitive games of 2023. Now disclaimer, I obviously have not played every game that came out this year. There were just simply too many games and not enough time to play them all. So if a game isn't on this list, then chances are I probably didn't play it, or it just simply wasn't good enough. But without further ado, here is my list of the top 20 games of 2023. But before I get into the actual top 20 list, let's address the elephant in the room and answer the obvious question. Is Baldur's Gate 3 the #1 game of the year or not? And I'm not gonna lie, Baldur's Gate 3 is definitely the best game of this year without a shadow of a doubt. BG3 just clears the rest of the competition no diff, like this could easily be considered one of the best games of the decade alongside Elden Ring and Red Dead Redemption 2. And I mean, just looking at what this game offers, it's easy to see why. The story is really deep and intricate with the help from the incredible voice acting. The sandbox type emergent gameplay is done pretty faithfully to the tabletop version of D&D, allowing you to tackle every situation in your own personal way. There's loads of replayable content in this game that'll keep you playing for literally hundreds of hours by yourself or with up to 3 friends. And the cherry on top is that Larian Studios is one of the most humble and consumer-friendly game studios right now in the industry. They don't put any microtransactions, DLCs, or weird monetization systems in their games. They just release a massive single-player game that you pay for once and update it for free with no BS attached. That's it. Absolutely based in Giga Chad Sven for not being a greedy corporal like the rest of the industry. So that's why Baldur's Gate 3 is my #1 game of the year. You know it, I know it, everybody knows it. And I mean, this was pretty much expected, so I just put it at the beginning so I'm not blueballing you guys with something so obvious. So now, let's get into the actual top 20 list.
Take our hourglass, hero. Collect your bearings and focus your mind. And enter Death's realm once again.
Starting at the 20th spot on this list goes to a little indie game called Death Must Die. Yeah, I know technically this game isn't out yet because it's still in early access, but I feel like I just had to put this game on this list because of how good it was. If you don't know what this game is, it's basically the passionate love child between Vampire Survivors and Hades, with all the great parts blended together in a beautiful matrimony. Yes, I know Death Must Die looks like yet another Vampire Survivors clone, which seems like a bunch of developers have caught an interest in this type of genre and wanted to make a game with their own spin on this formula. But the reason why I put this game over the other Survivor-likes on this list is because Death Must Die puts such an interesting spin on the Survivors-like gameplay that makes it essentially play like a completely different game. You see, unlike Vampire Survivors where the gameplay is more passive and all you really have to do is just avoid getting touched by the monsters while your spells automatically fire for you, in Death Must Die the gameplay is a lot more active because the enemies have different attack patterns that you actually have to dodge out of. And most bosses actually have mechanics that you have to play around to the point where it becomes more about skill rather than what build you have. This game is also pretty much fully voice acted and the art style is so incredibly good. Even though DMD is still only in early access, it still managed to impress me with its sheer amount of production value and uniqueness that it brought to the niche survivors-like genre. This is definitely one of the games that I'll be waiting for an eventual full release on in hopefully 2024. The 19th place goes to a fairly well-known indie game called Blasphemous 2. This game is pretty much the face of the sort of modern 2D Souls-like / Metroidvania genre, and there's a good reason for it. This game pretty much excels at everything that you could want in a Metroid / Souls-like hybrid. It has a beautiful art style and aesthetic that's based on Spanish Catholicism, a deep and interesting lore that's told through the environments and item descriptions, much like how the Souls-like stories are told. Gameplay where you have multiple different upgradable weapons and playstyles available to you, each of them tailor-made for completely different playstyles that you can swap between on the fly. Intense and difficult boss fights that will keep you on your toes the whole time, especially near the end where it gets incredibly difficult. A bunch of interconnected multi-layered areas filled with a plethora of hidden secrets and unlockables, and a kick-ass soundtrack inspired by classical Spanish guitar to boot. Blasphemous 2 is one of the most polished and well put together indie games that came out in 2023, and if you're looking for a nice Metroidvania game with the 1500s gothic aesthetic, then you really can't go wrong with Blasphemous 2. Number 18 on the list is Sea of Stars. Now this is one of the few games of 2023 that I was actually looking forward to because this game advertised itself as being reminiscent of the old school JRPGs that were released during the 90s. And for the most part, it did exactly that. It was a small, story-focused, turn-based RPG with a really charming pixel art style. Although the story is pretty much what you would expect from a typical JRPG story, albeit with a slight twist. The real stars of the show, get it? Because Sea of Stars and stars? Okay, I'll shut up now.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
The best elements of this game was not really the story, but instead the gameplay and the visuals. If I were to best describe what this game is, I would say that it's a combination of Super Mario RPG's gameplay with Golden Sun's art style and Chrono Trigger's story. All of these pieces of inspiration are beautifully mixed together to bring what feels like an old school classic 90s JRPG to the modern age with some much needed quality of life updates. If you're looking for a modern 2D RPG that mimics the feel of the classics, then Sea of Stars is one of the best games you can get for that feeling. And when you buy the game, the money definitely will be going towards supporting the developers, and it will not be sitting in a random bank account for over a decade. So how about making a donation? Now number 17 might be a little contentious, but after the hype in the honeymoon phase, I've come to realize that this game was a little overhyped. That game of course being Hogwarts Legacy. Now mind you, Hogwarts Legacy is still a good game, it's just not that good, and if I played more games this year, then it probably would have been replaced on this list. Unfortunately, I felt like the story was just a bit bland and lackluster, and the magic combat, while great in concept, I felt like wasn't exactly executed correctly, and just devolved into a reaction-based magic spam fest. Some people might have found the combat engaging, but to me, it doesn't really match the feeling of being a wizard slowly taking the time to cast these powerful and destructive spells to obliterate your enemies. But to compensate for that, the developers made the best recreation of Hogwarts and the locations in the Harry Potter universe that you could possibly make in a video game. The exploration and sense of adventure in this open world filled with numerous secrets and hidden treasures is amazing, and you can get lost in this world for hours on end just doing side content alone. The devs have done a bang up job recreating the magic of the Harry Potter universe, and the sales indicate that as this is the best selling game of 2023. It also didn't help that there's a huge controversy for this game that effectively served as free marketing to the public and led a bunch more people to buy this game, possibly in spite of the controversy itself. But even then, this is probably the best Harry Potter game that has ever been released, and if you're a fan of the Harry Potter series, then playing this is a must. At the 16th spot is an overlooked gem called Bomb Rush Cyberpunk. Now I say that because I haven't really heard much discourse about this game, especially on the internet, and that's really unfortunate because I would say that this is actually one of the best indie games of the year. For those of you who don't know what this game is, Bomb Rush Cyberpunk is a lovingly crafted spiritual successor to Jet Set Radio, made by this small indie team who had a strong passion for the series. It's a chill game where all you do is perform some cool parkour tricks on your skateboard or bike or whatever, and listen to some cozy techno hip hop songs. And listening to the soundtrack is such a vibe because all the songs are so mellow and just chill to listen to. This OST is like one of those lo-fi hip hop streams on YouTube that you use to study or fall asleep to. You know, the one with the anime girl studying. The story and art style is also incredibly unique that no other game has really done before. You basically play as a dude with a robot head who joins a small gang in order to do gang battles with other factions through parkour offs in order to reach the big boss of the gangs and get your original head back from him. It's a really charming and goofy story that doesn't take itself too seriously, and the stakes are never that high. If you're looking for an actual indie game of the year, Bomb Rush Cyberpunk will be one of my top recommendations. At the 15th spot goes to Dave the Diver, the indie game that's not actually an indie game, but apparently the Game Awards thought it was one for some reason, so it was still nominated for the best indie of the year. I don't know what that whole mess was, but Dave the Diver is absolutely not an indie game. Even the developers themselves stated that, but the Game Awards are going to do its thing, I guess. Anyways, this indie game was actually kind of a sleeper hit for me because I did not expect this game to be as good as it was. I thought it would just be a chill fishing game that you can play if you just want to have a calm, cozy experience. And while you can still have that in this game, Dave the Diver has so much more depth to it. Get it? More depth? Because he's a diver and... Okay, I'll stop now. Like, one half of this game is scuba fishing and exploration, while the other half is an entire restaurant management sim where you run a sushi restaurant and try to grow your business to be as big as possible. And everything is just weird and goofy in a good way. The characters that you meet throughout the game are surprisingly well developed and super memorable, like the shut-in weeaboo otaku gunsmith who loves his anime waifus and Mountain Dew. Now this one just feels like a jab. I mean, like, come on, this is supposed to be a video game, not real life, right? Right? Just me? All these features just add on to the already long list of incredibly fun and engaging minigames and side content that's littered all over throughout the game. I can see why this game was in consideration for best indie game of the year, even though it's not one. And that's because it's an extremely well polished and just straight up a fun game. If there's an award for best I can't believe it's not an indie award, then it should 100% go to Dave the Diver. Now the 14th spot on this list goes to Pizza Tower. This game kind of came out of nowhere for me because it wasn't really on my radar for 2023. But after hearing all the praise that it got, I decided to give it a try, and to my surprise, this game was actually really good. Yeah, the art style might be goofy and cartoonish, and it might put some people off at first. But if you play this game for long enough, these cartoonishly abstract visuals that are heavily inspired off the game Wario Land 4 for the Game Boy Advance eventually starts to really grow on you. And that's not to mention the absolutely insane and wacky gameplay where you play as an angry middle-aged Italian pizza chef trying to save their failing pizzeria from the clutches of a sentient flying pizza face, aptly named Pizza Face, who threatens to destroy our hero's pizzeria and only his pizzeria with a giant laser cannon. Yeah, I mean, who cares about world domination or destroying the entire planet with a giant death laser? He just wants to fuck you over in particular. So in order to stop him, you've got to climb his pizza tower, defeat all of his henchmen, and then blow up the entire thing. It's such a wild and nonsensical premise that stands out just from how plain weird it is. And the gameplay is also reminiscent of the 90s 2D side-scrolling platformers like Sonic the Hedgehog, with more modern quality of life changes that really polish this game to a near perfection. This small indie title is an extremely goofy and charming game that never really takes itself too seriously and just kinda throws at you whatever the devs have been smoking that day. If you're a fan of old school 2D side-scrolling platformers and over-the-top cartoony visual art styles, then you'll probably love Pizza Tower. At number 13 goes to Street Fighter 6. Capcom really took a big risk with this installment and completely went back to their urban hip-hop phase that Street Fighter was originally known for. But instead of going back to that same time period where all of our favorite characters were young, they pushed the setting forward into the modern era and aged our iconic cast past their prime years. And passing the torch down to a newer generation of fighters, as we can see, because Ryu is no longer the face of Street Fighter, but instead Luke is, in an attempt to sort of reboot the franchise and push it to a newer audience. It's a cool concept that pays homage to the longtime fans of the series, while also adopting a more modern outlook for Street Fighter. And I have to say, as someone who doesn't really play fighting games too much, I welcome these changes with open arms. The addition of the new modern controls are amazing for helping beginners learn the ropes of how fighting games work. The single player World Tour mode is actually incredibly fun, even though the RPG aspect does get kinda ridiculous later on. The Battle Hub is an awesome addition to the game that actually lets players socialize with each other using their very own demon spawn abominations they call custom characters. And of course, all of our favorite iconic characters that we all know well and love have been redesigned to fit a more modern audience. All of these characters have gone through a massive glow up in SF6, except for Ken. My man's going through a rough time in his life. Street Fighter 6 was a huge revival to the declining franchise numbers after the launch debacle and generally mixed reception of 5. If you're a new or veteran fighting player, then Street Fighter 6 is probably the best fighting game you can play right now. Number 12 on this list goes to Spider-Man 2. Now this is probably also a little contentious, but in my opinion, Spider-Man 2 is just a good, solid superhero title. On paper, it does everything well and includes all the bells and whistles that you expect from a AAA game. But if you're hoping that Insomniac would add some game-changing innovations to the sequel, then you'll be kinda disappointed because Spider-Man 2 is just more of the same thing. Except for MJ's face, which looks suspiciously similar to the lead writer's face. Now, some people might be fine with the lack of innovation, but for me, I kind of expect the sequel to add some more changes to the gameplay and systems. But either way, the combat does still feel really smooth like in the previous game, and this time you get some brand new toys to play with, so that's always fun. Web swinging throughout the expanded world is extremely satisfying to do, especially with the addition of the wingsuit, which is not really Spider-Man-like, but it's still pretty fun to use. And this time you get to play as both Peter Parker and Miles Morales, who each have their own unique characteristics and powers that make them so interesting to play as. But I do feel like the story isn't as strong in some areas, and the side content that was dotted throughout the world were a bit too bland and uninteresting for my tastes. Other than that, Spider-Man 2 is still a good superhero game, a great one even. And as a sequel, it completely lives up to the hype that the first game created. Number 11 goes to Star Wars Jedi Survivor. Now, some of you might be wondering why this is so low on my list, and that's because the PC performance on release was horrendous. It was so bad, in fact, that I actually had to refund the game on my PC and buy it again on my PS5 because the PC version would just keep crashing on my computer. And it wasn't just me, there were a bunch of other people that had problems with the PC port to the point where the devs had to issue an apology for it. But other than that, everything else about this game is incredibly well done. The Souls-like combat with a Star Wars flavor made each encounter and boss fight feel like a really precise dance that you carefully have to perform in order to overcome them. Except for that one frog boss, because holy hell, that boss is terrible. The game also innovates upon its predecessor's gameplay by adding different stances that all cater to a unique playstyle, and even coming with their very own skill trees. The story, although pretty predictable, still had some great character writing that made me enjoy every moment that the whole cast was on the screen. And all these combined with an expansive open world that's jam-packed with hidden side content and optional boss fights that make this game a really fun experience. Jedi Survivor pretty much improves upon every aspect over Fallen Order, while adding some new innovations to the already solid gameplay that was brought with the first game. And despite the performance issues, Jedi Survivor is still an amazing sequel that has me hyped for the final installment of the series. Now here's where we get to the top 10 list, and at number 10 we have Hi-Fi Rush. There was literally no hype, no announcement, no leaks for this game, and Tango Gameworks just said, hey, we made this game, here it is, and then proceeds to shadow drop Hi-Fi Rush the same day it was announced, and it was still an amazing game. Like, holy shit, what a completely based and Giga Chad moment for Tango Gameworks. And I mean, what more can I say about this game other than that it's just a genuine labor of love and passion. There's just so much personality, so much soul oozing from this game, and I absolutely loved every moment of it. I was playing this game smiling ear to ear the entire time because this felt less like a story about saving the world and more like a fun, light-hearted Saturday morning cartoon. It also helps that this game was genuinely hilarious and was filled with so many pop culture references everywhere. Hi-Fi Rush never takes itself too seriously and just completely focuses on having the most goofy and bombastic experience possible. The action combat where you're rewarded for playing on the beat is an extremely unique concept that was executed masterfully. The art direction is really vibrant and creative, which is made for one of the most iconic looking games this year. And of course, because this is a game that revolves around music, the soundtrack is absolutely kick-ass. If you're looking for a nice single-player AA game where you can just have a lighthearted, enjoyable time and just chill out for a weekend, then Hi-Fi Rush is pretty much the perfect game for that. Number 9 is Remnant 2. Now this game kind of went under my radar when it first came out because I wasn't really expecting much with this one. But when I tried this game out, I became immediately addicted. Remnant 2 pretty much takes all of the problems with the first game and fixes them while adding so many more features that make this game so much better than what I thought it would be. All of the guns feel crisp and satisfying to shoot. There's loads of enemy variety throughout each of the maps that all pretty much do something different. And the boss fights are even better this time around because they have so much more interesting mechanics and unique designs that make them so much more enjoyable to fight. The RPG mechanics and gearing system is also way more interesting now because it allows you to play a variety of different builds that you can tailor to your specific preference and playstyle. The environments are incredibly varied with so many different and unique biomes that make the gameplay feel fresh each run. And the fact that each of the areas you go through are procedurally generated and have their own unique storylines within them, which makes it so that each dungeon run and each world you hop through never feels the same. You genuinely never know what to expect when you go through that portal each time. I wasn't expecting much with Remnant 2 when it first came out, but after playing it, I've come to appreciate how much the developers took the criticism and feedback for the first game seriously and fixed all of them in the sequel. Remnant 2 is a great game and an amazing sequel that's an excellent addition to the Souls-like genre but with guns. Coming at number 8 is Armored Core 6. Man, FromSoft just does not miss even when they aren't making Souls-like games because AC6 is the best mecha game I've ever played in my life. The mecha genre in general has this negative stigma of being slow, clunky, and oftentimes boring. But that's not the case here in AC6 because it is the complete opposite here. It manages to make piloting a giant bulky 1,000-ton lump of steel really fast and intuitive. Also, the robot customization is super in-depth because it allows for a plethora of varied builds that are needed to tackle different objectives. Not only do you have to be kinda skilled at piloting your mech, but you also have to have the knowledge on what kind of mech you need to pilot because the builds that you choose for each mission definitely matters. This game is sort of like a puzzle to see if you can figure out the right build to beat each specific problem that the game throws at you. It might kinda be annoying to learn that you can't easily beat the game with one build, but I thought it was pretty cool because it forced players to think outside the box and try new things with their builds. Also, the weapon variety in this game is absolutely crazy and each one of them feels so satisfying to use because they're all flashy and weighty. This combined with some of the most insane boss encounters and the combat pretty much enters the realm of anime absurdism. And the level designs are so cool with there being a bunch of giant robots that you sometimes have to destroy that just give this game a massive sense of scale, like you're this tiny ant in this huge world. I don't know, I just really love that. This game pretty much takes this niche mecha genre and pushes it to a much larger audience and proves that the mecha games don't have to be boring and clunky. If you're a fan of FromSoft games, then I completely recommend that you try Armored Core 6 because it is a hell of a fun time.
Close your eyes.
Number 7 on the list is Lies of P. Speaking of games that surprised me this year, Lies of P completely astounded me with how brilliantly made this game was. Being developed by a studio that's never made a Souls-like game ever in their studio lifetime just completely came out of left field with Lies of P, and it was actually amazing. This game takes clear inspirations from Bloodborne's dark gothic horror aesthetic and adds a twist of mechanical body horror based on the Pinocchio fairy tale. It even includes the part where your father calls you a failure.
I know it. You're just useless. Puppet.
Is this supposed to be based on a fairy tale or real life? But even though this is yet another Souls-like game in the already crowded Souls-like genre, Lies of P adds its own gameplay innovations to the formula that makes it stand out from the other games in the same space. Like the weapon crafting system that lets you craft your very own unique weapon with its very own special attributes and movesets. This system is so creative, and I loved how large the variety of weapons and components there were that you can mix and match to create your own badass weapons. I also loved how this game encourages and rewards you for playing aggressively, just like Bloodborne did with its own version of the rally mechanic. Admittedly though, this game is a bit easier than FromSoft's Souls-likes, but some of the boss fights do make it for that because they can absolutely kick your ass. And of course, this being a Souls-like game, the bosses were all absolutely memorable and difficult to fight. If we're just talking about what's the best Souls-like game to release this year, then my vote absolutely goes to Lies of P. Coming at number 6 is Final Fantasy XVI. I know this one's a little controversial because a lot of people were disappointed with how FF16 turned out after all the hype, saying how boring the side content was, or how easy the combat was, or how the RPG systems were really lackluster, which are all valid criticisms, but for me, I actually love this game despite all of its flaws, because even though it has some low points throughout the game, the highest points FF16 achieves absolutely outweighs the low points for me. Things like the Titan fight or the Bahamut fight were the absolute peak of modern day cinematic action sequences. Not to mention the combat that they literally hired the lead combat designer for Devil May Cry 5 for, made yet another extremely fun and engaging combat system that's sadly bogged down by the incredibly easy enemy encounters. I also loved how the story follows the life of Clive as he goes from a naive and inexperienced teenager to a grizzled and brooding fully grown adult. I really enjoyed the more mature themes this iteration of a mainline Final Fantasy game brought to the table, and I really do hope that they'll continue this trend in future releases. And that isn't forgetting the incredible soundtrack that Masayoshi Soken cooked up in the kitchen, because he absolutely killed it with FF16's OST. And I mean, it is straight fire, and it 100% deserved to win Best Musical Score at the Game Awards. Even though this game did have some flaws, I think the positives vastly overshadow the negatives and were what made this game such a surreal experience for me. That's why Final Fantasy XVI is so high on my personal Game of the Year list. Now starting off the top 5, we have the Dead Space remake. After the massive disappointment that was the Callisto Protocol, which was supposed to be a spiritual successor to Dead Space, but in actuality it was just an inferior version of it in every single way. So the devs over at Motive Studios saw this and said, "Hold my beer," and proceeded to give us an actual successor to Dead Space, Dead Space. This game is a complete overhaul and improvement over the original 2008 version, and everything that this game adds makes the experience so much better. The graphics and visuals were completely redone from the ground up using modern technology to look absolutely gorgeous. The gameplay retains its horror elements and stays true to its survival horror roots, unlike the third game that fell down the generic action shooter trap. The devs also took the liberty to make some well-needed changes to a bunch of sections of the game that were highly criticized and completely changed them to be much more engaging in the remake, like the anti-gravity sections. Story was also fleshed out a bit more in the remake, as the cutscenes and dialogue were given more context and extra scenes to tell the story better, and they also gave Isaac an actual voice in this game as well, which is a much welcome change. After the disappointment that was the Callisto Protocol, the Dead Space fans wanted something that actually kept the spirit and soul of Dead Space, and Motive answered those prayers with this near perfect remake of it. Dead Space 2023 is definitely one of the best remakes this year. Speaking of best remakes, at number 4 we have Resident Evil 4 Remake. The remake of a beloved game that was already a masterpiece in its own right, but brought to the modern age with all the technological advancements made throughout the years. Even though the remake drastically changes everything from the original game, it still retains the core story beats and survival horror elements that everyone loved. And Leon Kennedy is still that same stoic badass roundhouse kicker that slings out one-liners as much as he slings out bullets.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
The action combat is still as tense and horrifying, but in the remake, Leon is given a bit more mobility now so you can maneuver a lot better in combat, making it much more intuitive to play than the tank controls in the original. The boss fights were also completely redone here to be much more intense and memorable this time around. Some of them being completely different from their older counterpart, like the first Crosser boss fight, which was originally an entirely QTE section, is now a fully playable boss battle that utilizes the new melee combat system, and it is badass. The remake brought some much welcome changes to the classic 2005 title, and manages to keep the same survival horror elements in the gameplay while also adding a ton of cinematic action set piece moments to the story. Hopefully if Capcom ever decides to remake Resident Evil 5, they keep the famous boulder punching scene. Now the third best game of the year goes to Tears of the Kingdom. Now this placement might be a little controversial, but I just really love the game at second place a lot more. That doesn't mean that Tears of the Kingdom is worse than the second place in any way, shape, or form. It's just that I felt like Tears was lacking in that soul aspect that I felt like the second and first place games had. But don't get me wrong though, this is still an amazing title that could have taken Game of the Year if Baldur's Gate 3 didn't release this same year. And that's because Tears of the Kingdom's world is gigantic and jam-packed with so many things to do. The amount of content in this game is absolutely insane. You could put over 100 hours in this game and you'll still have a ton of fresh new things that you could do. Although Tears does use the same map from Breath of the Wild, it expands on that and adds 2 completely new areas above and below the surface level that are filled with just as much content as the main region. And the biggest and most innovative addition to the game is the whole sandbox building mechanic that the whole game is based around. This is easily the best open world building system I've ever seen before. You can make pretty much anything your heart desires and use it to solve any problem that you might have, like the existence of Koroks. Tears of the Kingdom had some pretty big shoes to fill with the critically acclaimed Breath of the Wild being its predecessor, but somehow Nintendo have done it and made Tears of the Kingdom just as good, if not even better than Breath of the Wild. Hopefully if Nintendo ever decides to make another sequel, they keep the Korok torture, innovative building mechanics. Yeah. And before we get into the second best game of the year, I want to list some honorable mentions. These games were the ones that probably would have made this list, but unfortunately I didn't get a chance to play them since there were so many games that came out this year and I'm only one person. So these are the honorable mentions: Metroid Prime Remastered, Like a Dragon Ishin, Pikmin 4, Mortal Kombat 1, Super Mario Wonder, Alan Wake 2, RoboCop Rogue City, Like a Dragon Gaiden, The Man Who Erased His Name, and Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, which is just an expansion, but I felt like it was just too good that I had to mention it here. And now for the moment you've all been waiting for, my personal second best game of the year. The one game that beat out all the other games on this list. My personal favorite game of 2023. And at the number 2 spot for Game of the Year is Octopath Traveler 2. Now some of you who watched my Octopath Traveler video might have been able to guess this, but for those of you who haven't, Octopath Traveler 2 is my personal favorite game of 2023. This game is a masterpiece on all levels, and this is the one game that I would recommend all JRPG fans play. Octopath 2 took the solid foundation that the first game sets up and improves on every single aspect that was criticized in Octopath 1, while adding meaningful innovations to the gameplay. The turn-based combat in the sequel is a lot more refined and much more strategic with the addition of the latent power system, which acts basically as an ultimate ability. It's a seemingly small change, but it did wonders in improving the combat formula and making each battle feel fresh. The characters this time around are also massively improved to have some more compelling stories that actually make me care more about them and how they develop throughout their own personal journeys. But I will admit, the highly criticized part of Octopath 1 where the players felt like there wasn't enough banter between the party members is still kinda present in the sequel. Although it is to a slightly lesser degree because they did try to tackle the issue with the dual stories here and there, but it wasn't anything too crazy. And the music is the best soundtrack of the year, on par with Final Fantasy XVI's, but I would say that Octopath 2 has a lot more bangers in it. Like, just listen to some of these badass tracks. This whole OST is a certified hood classic, and it was pretty criminal that it didn't even get mentioned in the Game Awards. Instead, they wanted to shove more Fortnite advertisements down our throats. So that's why I'm mentioning it here. Stand proud, Yasunori Nishiki, because you, sir, can cook. And that's it for my best 20 games of the year. 2023 was an exciting time to be a gamer because of the sheer amount of just good games coming out. I'm not gonna lie, this was one of the best years in gaming history, period. I think a lot of people will look back fondly at this year and say that this was a good year for gaming because I know I would. And I cannot wait for what the next year has in store for us because it's looking pretty stacked already. But anyways, that's just my opinion. What do you think? Do you agree or disagree? Let me know down below and make sure to like, comment, subscribe for more content in the future. See ya.